settle back down. By the way, if you've got, after this session, we'll have an hour and a few minutes for lunch. And I'm asking you, if you've got your lunch now, please don't eat it while Michael and Sherry are talking, and just wait until afterwards. But there's plenty of food. We're not going to run out. If you have exact change, that would be, one of my students came up to me and says, everyone's only got 20. And I said, then charge them 20. I mean, they're in law school. This is the way, it's important to start teaching them, that sort of thinking at an early age. I don't know why. Our next two speakers are really interesting in the sense that both of them are established scholars. Sherry Colb, who was once on this faculty, it was a very sad day when she left. But Sherry is one of the leading criminal procedure scholars of our time. And Michael Dorf is a leading constitutional law scholar. And it's terrific when people with those sorts of background, both of them, he clerked for Justice Kennedy, right? And she clerked for Justice Blackmun. And when you have people like this who have really established themselves as leading scholars in other areas, and then they come to this with the sort of the gravitas that carries. And so, Sherry Colb is a major, everybody in criminal procedure, which is one of the courses I teach, everybody knows Sherry Colb. Everybody who teaches constitutional law knows Michael Dorf. So it's terrific to have them now focused on this issue. Sherry just had a recent book come out called Mind If I Order the Cheeseburger? One of the many idiotic questions that you get when you are a vegan. And I'm really delighted. We've made it till 12:20. We made it till 12:27 without anybody asking, but what about planes? It's just remarkable. And I do want to say that we have with us today the finest veterinarian I've ever known, Dr. Melissa Resnick, who is eager to answer your questions about vegan cats. So, no, I'm only kidding. She's not. She's not. She doesn't want to talk to you about vegan cats. But anyway, Sherry went to Columbia, Harvard Law School. She clerked for Judge Feinberg on the Second Circuit, and then for Justice Blackmun. She's a terrific scholar. Her animal work is wonderful. Michael Dorf is originally a physicist. Went to Harvard College, Harvard Law School, and clerked for Justice Kennedy. He has a blog called Dorf on Law, which is actually very influential within the academic legal business. And they're both terrific, and I'm delighted to have them. They're the second couple of today, and I'm delighted to have them. So I don't know who's going first. Okay, very good. Thank you, Michael and Sherry. Have a good
Thank you, Sherry. It's really cool to come back to Rutgers. I haven't been back here in about 6 years, and it's really fun and nice. So the first thing I want to say is that given the time that I'm speaking, it makes me aware of a study that was done in Israel on judges and parole boards. Some of you might be familiar with the study, where what determined how generous the judges were with granting parole, the one factor was how long it's been since the judges had eaten. And so, the really generous sort of, yeah, he'll be fine happened right after breakfast, and then really punitive, I think he'll offend again, came right before lunch. So with that in mind, I hope you'll be merciful presentation. So my presentation today and my groups are part of a book that we're writing together on two movements that we think share many features, although they don't in terms of membership really overlap much at all, which is the animal rights movement and the anti-abortion movement. So my topic, because I figured it wasn't controversial enough to talk about, so my topic for today is welfarism within the two movements. And what you might describe as a, quote, all or nothing versus compromise commitments for progress approach. So the first thing to note is that in terms of both of these movements, there's a movement view, or at least a general movement view, versus a mainstream view. So mainstream people see both of these issues as falling along a continuum spectrum. So for animals, mainstream view is that some harms to animals are wrong. So typically like dog fighting and, quote, abuse on, quote, factory farms is wrong, but nice family farms where the animals are like your children except for the slaughtering them and feeding them part are okay. And for abortion, the mainstream view is that embryos are less entitled to protection, to life, than fetuses, and fetuses are less protected, less entitled than born children. So, the mainstream view is that different methods of abortion have different moral weight, and depending on when the abortion takes place during pregnancy and the method, so we have the Partial Birth Abortion Act, the federal ban on so-called partial birth abortion, and also the mainstream view that different reasons are important to consider, and so if somebody's having an abortion because their child will be disabled, people tend to view that as less objectionable than having an abortion because the person wants to be slim, which I've never heard of anyone actually having an abortion for that reason, but that's at least put forward as one possible reason. So both of the movements, the animal rights movement and the anti-abortion movement, reject these lines that mainstream culture draws. And the law, of course, reflects and endorses the mainstream lines that the movements reject. So we have a hierarchy of animal uses in the law. Some are considered okay, some are not. And there are hierarchies of abortion in the law. So the law recognizes different stages of pregnancy as distinct in terms of the moral weight of abortion. Different methods are different, different reasons are different. So we might refer to abortion regulations about what stage of pregnancy, what reason, what method as welfare measures. Obviously, they're not literally directed at benefiting the welfare necessarily of fetuses, but they regulate rather than attempt to abolish a practice, and they attempt to aim at what the public finds most offensive, which is, of course, something we see in the animal rights movement as well. So the abortion regulations might say later abortions are impermissible. So after a certain point in pregnancy, the kind that look like live birth is considered more objectionable. So the so-called partial birth abortion is that because the fetus is removed before being killed, that seems more like labor and delivery, and also abortions for bad reasons. And regulations on abortion of this sort are obviously inconsistent with the view that an embryo is morally equivalent to a born child. So if you take the view, which I'm defining it as the pro-life movement, obviously there are people who fall along the spectrum, but somebody who's within the core of the pro-life movement would say that an embryo, that life begins at conception, and by life meaning the morally weighty life, and that an embryo is just as morally valuable as a born child. So treating different stages of pregnancy differently is at odds with that vision. And there's obviously an inconsistency within the animal rights movement too, of saying, well, all animals are entitled to the basic right not to be exploited and not to be tortured or slaughtered, but at the same time endorsing things like gestation crate laws and other attempts to create a better welfare situation. How do the movements deal with this inconsistency between these measures on the one hand and the core commitments of the movement? So only a minority of both of the movements oppose these so-called incremental measures that manifest the public's priorities, although at least in the animal rights movement that core is growing, I think. And so one of the questions we ask is, should the two movements respond differently? Is there anything about the two movements from a strategic point of view that would lead, or a philosophical point of view, that would lead to different answers to the question about incremental change? So one way we might look at it is to ask, well, what has worked strategically? And it appears, at least, I think it appears that we think it appears, that that this kind of incremental legislation has worked much better for the pro-life movement than it has worked for the animal rights movement. So if you look at the pro-life movement, there are fewer abortions per person over time than there were in the past. So to take a date, 1981, there were 29.3 abortions per 1,000. I don't know what a 0.3 of an abortion is, but per 1,000 of women of childbearing age, and then the number went from 29.3 to 19.4 by 2005. So you have 29 to 19, so that's a reduction. Obviously we could attribute that to other things, but at least on its face, it seems to have worked better. It seems not so much to have worked for the animal rights movement, because there's really a greater consumption of animal products now, certainly than there were before a lot of these welfare measures got started. On the other hand, it's really hard to assess what works, right? So in one respect, the pro-life movement has been a failure, a major failure, which is the growth of the fertility industry. To the extent that you take the view that life begins at conception, the fertility industry is really quite a blow, because it has grown astronomically, it's widely accepted. People, I think the person who came up with in vitro fertilization was celebrated. It's not even nobody says, well, how can you celebrate that violence? It's just, it would sound incoherent, almost as incoherent as saying, how can you celebrate the violence of animal exploitation? In the U.S., just for those of you wondering, how is fertility medicine antithetical to the life of an embryo? In the U.S., the way that fertility medicine is practiced creates surplus embryos, and those eventually decay or die or are terminated, and there are battles often between the couples on what to do with them, or they're used in embryonic stem cell research. So people, and the mainstream, continues to see early embryos as less morally valuable than later ones. And it's arguable that that view has been entrenched by legislation that was supported by the pro-life movement. As to animal rights groups and animal welfare measures, it's possible that there would be even more animal consumption without welfare campaigns. It's difficult to know what a different path might have yielded. Some people have attributed a recent drop in the consumption of meat to welfarism. I'm not sure whether the report was that there are 500,000 fewer land animals currently being consumed in the United States than some number of years ago. I haven't looked closely at that claim, so I can't say whether it's accurate. But even if it is accurate, it could just as easily be attributed to vegan messaging. So when somebody says, for example, oh, well, I've discovered, and there's a new book about making claims about, empirical claims about what sort of advocacy does and doesn't work. And the claim is, well, you look at all these people who, because of the campaigns, have started eating fewer animal products. And my claim would be, or I would at least consider the possibility, that they've started eating fewer animal products because they've seen vegans, and this is their compromise with that, rather than because somebody has told them to compromise in the very beginning, and that they said, oh, I'm going to do exactly what you told me to do. But it does seem that the strategy has worked better for the pro-life movement, although it's uncertain. For guidance then on how the two movements should react to, should deal with these sorts of things, beyond looking at what works, we might also look at people outside the movement and what, because those are the people to whom the movements are advocating, and also the people opposing them. So the two outsiders to the movement, the audience and the opposition. So the audience, who are the audience? Well, in the United States, mainstream Americans. So we might ask, how receptive are mainstream Americans to the vegan message? How invested are they in their current views? And I would say that most people are most invested in views that correspond to how they live their lives. So most Americans' involvement in both abortion and animal exploitation is if there is involvement as consumers. Right? Most people don't perform abortions, and most people don't slaughter animals directly. So abortion. So 1.2 to 1.3 million women have had an abortion each year. I don't mean that some women have an abortion every year, or that they number 1.3 million, but that every year that number of women have an abortion. And that sounds like a lot of people. 33% of women by the age of 45 have had an abortion, but that still means a majority of women have not had an abortion, and in any given year, only 2% of women of childbearing age have one, and no men, so far as I know, have had abortion. Right? So even though it's a large number of people, it's still a minority of the population. Then turn to animal consumption. So how invested are people going to be in the views that support their daily practices with respect to animals? Well, the average American consumes almost 2 pounds of animal products every day. One animal in this group is a bird related to the jungle fowl, the chicken. 24 million chickens are slaughtered every day to meet U.S. demand. Over 600,000 male chicks are killed every day as waste of the egg industry, and hatcheries that provide hens to organic, local, humane farms, as well as factory farms. So, animal exploitation involves an overwhelming majority of the human population killing an overwhelming number of animals, not in a lifetime, but every day, several times a day. So this leads to the thought of what's called motivated reasoning, right? Where people are strongly motivated to reason their way to a conclusion that supports what they already want to think. And it drives many people to view animal pain and slaughter as morally permissible. The animal rights movement in that sense faces a much more challenging job than the pro-life movement. And so what does that mean? It could mean that the pro-life movement can afford an uncompromising approach. It could afford to be morally consistent and say no compromise with evil. The audience resistance factor might seem to counsel compromise for the animal rights movement because of the enormity of audience resistance. So before we conclude on that point, the second factor is people, the second group of outsiders, people who are outside the movement, not the audience, the adversaries. So who are the adversaries? The main adversary of the pro-life movement, I would say, is the pro-choice movement. The pro-choice movement has at its core a mix of two different ideas, with emphasis on one or more than the other in various contexts. One is that embryos and fetuses lack moral status. A second is that women have sovereignty over their bodies and get to decide what happens with their bodies. So if we look at prohibitions against late-term abortions, for example, obviously they are in tension with the pro-life idea that all abortions are the same, right? To the extent that a zygote is morally equivalent to a baby, the idea of singling out partial birth or late-term abortion as especially bad is inconsistent with the idea. It's in tension. But it's also very much in tension with the adversaries' ideas, right? If a late-term abortion is a problem, then that means that moral status precedes birth. And if any abortions are prohibited, it means that women lack total sovereignty. So in the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, almost any abortion regulation threatens one or both tenets of the pro-choice way of thinking about abortion, that both of something, not someone, but refer to embryo, and also female sovereignty. So it may not be a betrayal of the pro-life ideology to make these movements, because the pro-life movement is both an ideology and an adversary of another ideology. And in its second role, supporting laws that prohibit some kinds of abortion help dismantle the opposition even as it doesn't fully manifest the position. So now to the animal rights movement and its adversary. So who's the adversary? The animal exploiting industry would be that adversary. They use animals as resources. They obviously think it's morally permissible, and the philosophy behind it is animals are here for us to use them responsibly. So one thing that you don't hear from the animal-using industries is they do not say animal suffering doesn't matter. That used to be, so they think that, plainly, but they don't say that. They don't say, we can torture animals at will. We're happy to spread videos of what we do. And we have special We oppose gag bills. We don't know why anyone would come up with them because we want to advertise precisely what we're doing. What they say is, I love my animals, they provide my income, and I have to take care of them to make a profit. And that's a standard thing to say. Now, the fact that that is just that could be a photo under the word falsehood in the dictionary doesn't mean that that's not what they say. That's a part of the idea. It's the idea of animal husbandry. Right? Animal welfare legislation then is a version of animal husbandry, right? Use, but responsibly or with compassion. And so the message of animal welfare is inconsistent with animal rights theory, right? Because it's first of all, it permits, it implicitly says that it is acceptable to use animals, it is acceptable to slaughter animals, and then this is how you should do it. And it involves people who actually reject that idea in designating the best ways to kill animals and so on, and to hold them in captivity and so on. So it's inconsistent with animal rights theory, and it is also not a threat to the industry's core value, which makes it different from pro-life support for abortion regulations, right? Because here is animal welfare regulations are philosophically both at odds with animal rights theory and perfectly consistent with the idea of animal husbandry. And it's in fact interesting that you'll have conversations with people and everyone can agree that it's really terrible to hurt animals, and that if you would say, oh, so you're a vegan, they'll look at you like you're out of your mind. Like, wait, first of all, what is vegan? And I don't know, vegging when I'm watching TV, I guess that's vegging. So animal welfare legislation sort of enforces and affirms principles of animal husbandry. So in a way, what you're left with is a pro-life movement can sort of go either way. It can refuse to compromise because its audience is more open to the idea that abortion might be wrong. Now, their people's individual lives, unless they're advocates or participants in abortion, don't have as much of an investment in thinking otherwise. Or they can support incremental legislation and thereby threaten the pro-choice paradigm. The animal rights movement, in a sense, is in a real bind because it faces enormous audience resistance and thus finds it hard to avoid incrementalism, even though welfare reform measures are at odds with its philosophy. And I don't think I'm saying anything distinct from what somebody within animal welfare who's a vegan would say, which is, well, of course what's going on, of course a colony cage is not okay. I mean, this is what will happen, is that somebody who is pushed for colony cages for chickens will say, well, of course they're not okay, they're just not as bad. And so it really is at odds with the underlying philosophy. I'm sure a lot of you saw that at Whole Foods, they had a sign over the meat that said something like, I have a hearty helping of animal compassion with every order. And so that's really the celebration of what they understood to be the animal welfare approach, which is here we're doing all the right things. And so it's ideologically consistent with the opponent's approach. So you're both driven to incrementalism by audience resistance and simultaneously sort of driven away from incrementalism by the fact that incrementalism is so difficult to distinguish from your adversary's approach to the problem, and also completely at odds with your approach. So that sounds like very depressing news for the animal rights movement, but it doesn't rule out all incremental steps. So for example, you might promote laws, right, that even though they're laws, and obviously we're not going to have a law that says nobody gets to kill animals while 98% or more of the population is consuming animal products, but you can promote transparency, available information about animals' lives and deaths. You can empower ethical vegans, for example, in prisons, where people sometimes become ethical vegans and then find that prisons are unwilling to accommodate them and say, well, here you can have fish. And what might be funny in a cafeteria where you actually have options becomes a lot less funny for a prisoner who is trying to assert, well, actually a fish is not a plant. And so you can also, schools, children at schools are often encouraged or, given milk and so on, and they can be, despite the fact that it's not healthy for them. I don't want to go into that discussion, but it's awful for them, and many of them are members of minority groups that actually find it physically makes them sick. And people in nursing homes. A lot of people find in nursing homes, there aren't that many vegans in nursing homes, but those who are vegan find they don't get accommodated. So that we can use the law to require that people not be forced to participate in animal exploitation against their will. So these are steps that can be taken. The pro-life movement actually already does all of these things in addition to pushing legislation, right? Mandatory ultrasounds are a way of exposing people to abortion when they might not want to see it. Opt-outs by medical professionals are a way of recognizing that the right of people not to participate. Providers and pharmacies and pharmacists can do that, and the pro-life movement already engages in uncompromising advocacy. So it's actually rare that you'll hear a pro-life advocate, even when they're promoting like a partial birth abortion ban, for them to say, well, it's not as bad if it's early. They actually manage somehow to push these measures while simultaneously staying on message. So I think we think that the animal rights movement has a lot to learn from the pro-life movement, as both face similar challenges, and it's worthwhile to point out what some of the commonality between the two movements are. Obviously, both movements seek to protect a vulnerable, and I take both movements at their word. So obviously, one could be cynical about either movement, but at their word, both movements are about protecting vulnerable life against violence. And nonetheless, I think that it's interesting to note that few people are members of both, although some are, and so that's part of what we'll be exploring in our book. Some of the strange things about the two movements where they seem not to overlap at all. But I think the animal rights movement, as I said, has a lot to learn from the pro-life movement, as both face similar challenges, and I'm interested in your reactions and questions.
She's interested in your reactions and questions, but not until after you've So first, I also want to add my thanks to Gary Francione. Where'd you go?
Oh yeah, I want to thank Gary too.
For inviting us, and as I say, as I indicated in my question to Gary Steiner, I credit Gary for my being a vegan, which is one of the best decisions I've made in my life. It was indirect, but it's a very powerful influence. So just a little more background on this book. So sometimes when we talk about this book, people assume that, well, they make all sorts of assumptions. People who know us know that we are both actually pro-choice with respect to abortion. So there's a big piece of the book is trying to explain how those positions are consistent, although not necessary, but that they are consistent. And it actually starts with a chapter in Sherry's book, Mind If I Wrote the Cheeseburger. Her book is organized around questions people ask vegans. Mind if I wrote the cheeseburger? What about plants? And one of them is, so are you pro-life? And in thinking about that, we realize not only are there a lot of interesting philosophical points of overlap there, but there are these interesting questions for the social movement. So the way this new book is organized is part one is sort of philosophical pieces, right, ways in which commitments about one set of questions can or does translate into commitments about the other set of questions. And then the second half is about the social movements. So Sherry just presented to you a sort of condensed version of a chapter on strategy writ large. There's also a chapter there on two different kinds of tactics. One about the use of violent imagery by the pro-life movement on the one hand and by the animal rights movement on the other, and then another chapter on the use of violence in the respective movements. The reasons we chose to present the chapter that Sherry just presented in the chapter I'm about to present is because they have the most overlap with the question of welfarism versus rights. And so I'm going to talk now about a chapter that comes from our philosophy section. And this is a chapter that talks about the question of, how do I start? Okay, from the beginning. Okay, is death harmful to animals? And the reason I want to address this is because, right, of the movement of so-called happy meat. Right, there's this trend over the last decade or decade and a half or some odd, right, in which you see people who profess, and I take seriously their profession, that they care a lot about animals, but they're willing to eat ethically sourced meat and other animal products. And part of that is because of a philosophical position, whether they articulate it or not, that death is not harmful to animals, right? So another way of putting this is, does Epicureanism support welfarism? Okay, so to back up a little bit, right? So Jeremy Bentham, pictured here. If you go on the internet and look for pictures of Jeremy Bentham, about half of them are of either his rotting corpse or of the so-called autodidact that is sort of stand-in for his writing. It's very weird. I've chosen a painting because my position with respect to graphic imagery, right? So in the language that Gary Steiner quoted this morning, right, this is a famous quote from Bentham. I've highlighted in red the relevant part, but the whole thing is actually very, this portion is very pro-animal. It turns out Bentham later sort of takes it back. But the idea is, right, the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And so that is a kind of leaping off point for a lot of what becomes the contemporary animal rights movement. It's a little odd that it's animal rights movement, since of course Bentham famously referred to rights as nonsense on stilts, right? And but you see this again, right? That gets repeated in the contemporary period, right? Peter Singer, who's also a utilitarian through animal liberation, sort of launches or gives a big impetus for the animal rights movement. But the question arises, right, if the question is can they suffer, then, well, is it okay to eat them if you can eat them without making them suffer, right? And that's a question that has sort of deep philosophical implications, in particular because of what I'm calling the Epicurean view. That's Epicurus. I couldn't find an oil painting of him, certainly not his rotting corpse. But despite looking, I don't know, kind of unhappy in this bust, Epicurus was known for his, quiet acceptance of life, his happiness, and so forth, right? In modern usage, Epicureanism is sometimes conflated with hedonism, but that's not Epicurus' actual view, right? Epicurus, in this context, is most famous for this statement. He's trying to explain why you shouldn't worry about death. He says, death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that when we're alive, death has not come because we're alive. And when death has come, we are not there, you're gone. There's no you to experience death, so stop worrying, be happy. Right? That's the Epicurean view, right? That's the source for it. And so if that view is true, one might think, well then, okay, I can eat my happy meat, right? Because just make sure that the animals live a happy life on the farm in the Chipotle commercials, and then sneak up on them when they're not looking and instantaneously and painlessly kill them, right? So that's the sort of the Epicurean implication, right? Sudden and painless death is harmless, right? And therefore, happy meat is morally acceptable. So this is the challenge that we address in this chapter of our book. And I say it's a challenge in, I'm sort of putting air quotes around challenge, because it's only a challenge, I think, to academics, right? That is, if you talk to the person on the street and you say, if I just snuck up to you and you weren't expecting it and put a bullet in your head and killed you instantaneously and painlessly, I wouldn't have harmed you because of what this ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus said. Right? They think you were insane. Right? They say, of course, death is harmful. But one of the things that academics do, perhaps the only thing we do, is we take seemingly ridiculous propositions seriously. Not all seemingly ridiculous propositions, but some seemingly ridiculous propositions turn out to be kind of hard to rebut, right? So Epicurus' view is not obviously wrong, right? The person on the street, if you actually, you can get them to talk to you rather than to run away, right? If you said, no, seriously, tell me, how is it that you were harmed, right? They might have a hard time. So we want to take this seriously, and that's what I'm about to do. So one way that you can take something seriously and show that it's still not right is to show that what we say in law school, it proves too much, right? It has implications that are themselves quite worrying. So one thing to remember is, of course, Epicurus was talking not about animals, but about humans, not about non-human animals. He's talking about humans. He thought death, it's not that he thought death isn't a harm to pigs, but it is to humans. He thought death isn't a harm to anybody. And so a kind of obvious and troubling implication is that if happy meat is morally acceptable, so is happy cannibalism, right? I could not only sneak up behind the person and shoot him in the head instantaneously and painlessly, but also then eat his remains, and I would have committed a harmless act. And most people will find that troubling. Well, okay, so we can go and say, well, why exactly is that troubling? And we might think about other reasons why Epicurus may not be right, right? So the first of these is that humans and other animals are social beings. So even if, right, I don't harm the particular person whom I shoot instantaneously and painlessly, right, that person has loved ones that they will leave behind, which is why it's important when you're a cannibal to wipe out the entire family. But in fact, right, a lot of the sort of psychological suffering that you see on farms is about kinship relationships that are destroyed, right? So think about dairy cows bellowing for their calves who are taken away for veal, even if you think that it's not harmful to the calf that is then going to be slaughtered, even if the calf were to be slaughtered instantaneously or painlessly, it is a harm to the mother who's left behind to grieve for her baby. Second, right, of course, and this is sort of the obvious point, right, so on the Epicurean farm, right, where the farmers are constantly sneaking up on the animals and killing them, but not alerting any of the other animals that that's what's going on, right, fine, that would be ethical, but that's not the way it exists anywhere in reality. So that's a sort of important non-implication. And finally, and this is, I think, the sort of, in some ways, the most important point I want to make, right, which is that vegetarianism is sometimes offered, is sometimes embraced by welfareists who see veganism and abolitionism as sort of extreme, right? So they are welfarist in their advocacy and vegetarian in their daily lives, both as sort of, well, halfway compromises. But if you take the Epicurean view seriously, and if you take the sort of Singer view, right, that says that, right, the main thing is the suffering, to try to prevent them, then you'll see that vegetarianism isn't a compromise at all. You're better off, morally, if you're an Epicurean, eating meat rather than, certainly than dairy products, because there's more extended suffering in the products that are the result of the continuous exploitation of the animals than of the ones that are killed. So that even though vegetarianism is thought of as a kind of, less extreme version on the road to veganism by some people, or they don't go on that road, or it's a compromise. It's an incoherent compromise. It's not a compromise that is recommended in any way at all by the notion that, well, death isn't a harm. What we care about is suffering. Okay, so those are the Epicurean non-implications, but I still haven't really responded to Epicurus. It could still be the case, right, that death isn't a harm. I don't want to leave you here thinking that because, God knows what you go out and do. So here's my simple response to Epicurus, right? Our simple response to Epicurus, right? Killing someone, whether that someone is a human or another sentient animal, harms that someone by depriving him or her of something that was his or hers, namely his or her life, right? The idea is that when you kill somebody, it's not, here's the next point, right? Put differently, the Epicurean argument purports to show that death is not a bad state for one to be in. And we can agree with that, we can concede, right? Nobody is unhappy, nobody is suffering when they're dead. Nonetheless, right, the Epicurean argument does not show that the deprivation of life is harmless, right? Depriving somebody, killing somebody is not harmful because death is a bad state to be in, which is the point that Epicurus is rebutting. It's because it deprives them of the rest of their life. Now, I'll come back to whether that's a satisfactory answer in a moment. Maybe that's a good answer to Epicurus for us, but not for animals, right? So maybe the welfarist might say, aha, only a human being can suffer by being deprived of the rest of his or her life, not an animal. This view relies on a claim one sometimes sees in the philosophical literature that human beings are diachronic, meaning we have an extended lifetime over time, but most other animals are synchronic, meaning they only exist sort of moment to moment. Right? They don't have a contemplation of the future. You see this view in Peter Singer's work, right? He says only humans and perhaps apes, dolphins, and or elephants have life plans. Right? Those are the kinds of beings who are harmed by death in a way that other sorts of animals are not. Even Tom Reagan, who is closer to the sort of abolitionist position, acknowledges that there might be so-called lower animals who are sentient, but are not what Reagan calls subjects of a life, right? And these views would require, as a criterion for having an interest in avoiding death, in continuing life, something more than Bentham's question of whether they can suffer, right? It's not enough that you can suffer, that you are entitled to the rest of your life. You have to be, in Reagan's term, the subject of a life, or in Singer's even more stringent term, you need to have a life plan. The problem with the view, of course, is it's, first of all, it's false as an empirical matter, right? Non-human animals are diachronic. They don't just exist in the moment. Here are some examples, right? What's going through that squirrel's head as he's burying his nuts? Is he thinking, I would really love to eat this nut right now. Gee, I should do that. After all, what care have I for the morrow? I'm merely a synchronic being. No. Right, he's burying his nuts because he has some conception of the future. Now, you might say, well, wait a second, maybe it's just sort of an instinct. Well, it's not just sort of an instinct. Squirrels have been observed when they're being watched by other squirrels, they'll go dig up their nuts and bury them somewhere else because they're worried that, that squirrel's going to steal my nuts. So the squirrels are thinking about the future. There are other examples of this, right? Here this bird is building a nest, right? What's going through her head? Is it, this sure is fun, building this nest. I'm glad I'm not out doing anything else because I just love building the nest for its own sake. No, she's got some conception of the future. Finally, this is a famous dog named Hachiko, who in the first part of the 20th century, Hachiko's person, Professor Ueno, died. Hachiko had been in the habit of waiting for the professor at the train station every day when he came home, and Hachiko continued to do that every day for 9 years after the death of Hachiko's person. Some people, I think, take this as a view that, oh, didn't realize he was dead. No, I think Hachiko realized, but was sort of mourning and was ever hopeful that something new that this time he would come off the train station. There's some notion here that the animals have a vision, some idea of the future. So this idea that non-human animals are synchronic seems to me wrong. But in any event, who cares? Right? Here's the problem with the focus on having a life plan, right? It doesn't respond to the Epicurean challenge, right? Suppose somebody formulates and begins to live out his life plan, but then dies suddenly and painlessly. He will not actually experience frustration of his life plan. So on the Epicurean logic, death for him is no worse than it is for a human who lived day to day, or a so-called lower animal who is incapable of formulating a life plan, right? It's not at all clear why having a life plan means that you are harmed by having the life plan not fulfilled once you're gone. You need some other kind of an argument. So where are we left? I think we can say that death does deprive the being who died of the enjoyment of his future life, whether or not that future life would have included fulfilling a life plan or just having enjoyment day to day. We recognize that this view does depend on a very widespread but admittedly problematic view about continuity of identity over time. In the chapter in the book, we get into this a little bit. We find that the literature on personal identity is kind of like, it's mostly science fiction, and that we end up endorsing a sort of reductionist view of the sort of plain, ordinary sense of identity with which all of us seem to live our lives, which is that yes, of course we change. You can never step in the same river twice. That's true of persons, animals, etc. But you can't really live a coherent life without at least imagining that you continue to exist as, in some sense, the same person over time. And that's roughly true for other animals. And then finally we say that if we're wrong about identity, then there may be no persuasive answer to the Epicurean challenge, but to come back to the cannibalism response, if that's so, then the non-answer is the same for humans and other animals. So in the end, the Epicurean challenge isn't really about animals at all. Finally, just a little bit of bonus content, since the book is also about abortion. Let me just say this. I want to raise the question of Anna Bagenholm, who was a hiker in somewhere in Northern Europe, somewhere, I don't remember. It might have been Switzerland or one of the Scandinavian countries. I'm guessing from the little circle over the A that it was like Sweden or something. But anyway, so she's hiking along and she falls into a freezing pond and is underwater for about 2 hours, during which she is dead. Along come some other hikers. They discover her and they bring her to a hospital where she is has her body temperature slowly raised, and she recovers. She's alive. It's an amazing case. The consequence of this and other cases have led to the development of certain therapies for reviving people who suffer heart attacks and so forth. But in any event, it does raise an interesting ethical question, which is, how was Anna Bagenholm, during the time when she was dead, before she got revived, any different from a pre-sentient embryo or fetus? The punchline to our book, I told you that we are pro-choice. One of the things that are part of our view is that certainly pre-sentient embryos and fetuses don't have the same moral status as sentient animals. But the question then is, as a challenge, you might ask, well, is sentience really the precondition for moral consideration if one considers that Anna Bagenholm wasn't sentient when she was frozen? I know you're dying to know the answer, I can tell. And so the question is, does her example rule out sentience as the criterion for a right to continued life or continued non-interference with one's life? Here are our answers. One, we develop what we call a moralized endowment effect. The endowment effect, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, it's a psychological phenomenon in which people are much more averse to losing something than to not getting it in the first place. This has been demonstrated in all sorts of different contexts. That's just a psychological phenomenon. We say the endowment effect actually has moral content. That it is in many circumstances, it is morally worse to take something away from somebody than not to bestow it itself, and that's true with respect to life itself. And you see this broadly recognized, that there is a connection between having sentience and other sorts of rights in the context of abortion, from the fact that there are these laws being passed in various state legislatures regarding pain-capable abortions. And they're not laws that say that if you're going to abort a pain-capable fetus, you have to give the fetus anesthesia. They're laws that forbid abortion of pain-capable fetuses. We think that that shows a sort of broad recognition that people recognize that the ability to suffer has entailments for not just the right to avoid suffering, but the right to continue to live. Okay, so that's where we are. I guess we've got, like, I don't know, 3 minutes for questions? Yes?
Hi, my question is for Sherry.
Yes.
Thank you so much for talking. And I understand that you're taking a position of an analyst who is trying to look at the pro-life movement and distill that which is effective that could be applied to animal abolition or animal liberation movement. And as such, you're operating from the standpoint where you take the axiomatic premises, ideological premises of pro-life movement as given and
Yes.
value their gestures and their techniques against those givens. Now, I just wonder about something specific that you said that sort of represents my anxiety about your presentation quite well, is when you were talking about the mandatory ultrasounds as a technique to make, I suppose, the women, future customers of abortions to face what abortion is. And I was just, when you said it, and then you moved on to the next thing, I was just a little bit startled because for me, mandatory ultrasounds is an extremely violent and invasive form of sexualized violence. And I was wondering if in our research, even if we do take that position, do we need to qualify it somehow and to extend that to a larger question when we say that the animal liberation movement, which is an ethical movement that strives for justice, that we have a lot to learn from inherently oppressive movements such as pro-life. How do we need to qualify it?
Okay, that's a great question. So one thing I'd say is that I think that to some degree both movements share the potential oppressiveness of exposing people to violent imagery. And that's one of our chapters is about violent imagery. And I had an experience earlier this week where I was on Facebook and a friend of mine had posted a video, and now I guess some videos start running, even if you choose not to click on them. And it was a video, and there was a German Shepherd, so I thought, oh, it'll be a cute dog video, and it was actually, as it turned out, a video of a German Shepherd being slaughtered. And it really traumatized me, and I think about that when I consider exposing people to footage of what happens in a slaughterhouse or any other, as Gary said earlier, it's traumatic, it's something that really alters you in ways. And so I think that that's a real question, and it's a question that both confront, and that when I say that we need to learn, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to adopt every strategy without critical analysis. But I think it's useful to look at it and consider it as something that could be deployed potentially in a responsible way in our movement. I also think that to some degree, the mandatory ultrasound, as you said, that there's a sexualized violence component to it that is distinct from showing people footage. And it's also true that it targets women individually in a way that a lot of the advocacy that we do for animals does not. So people are not sort of grabbed when they're buying meat and pulled into a room where they're forced to watch video footage of how that animal was treated and what happened in order to bring it. Now maybe, I mean, I think there's a part of all of us within the movement that kind of feel like, well, maybe you ought to be exposed to that because you are actually participating in it. And I think that's probably the same impulse that drives the mandatory ultrasound. So I think there are problems that may be unique and or more or heightened. And one of the ways in which, and it's not to give away the punchline for us, but one of the ways in which we would distinguish between the pro-life movement and the animal rights movement is about what is at stake for the being who's, you know, for the person who's being asked to stop committing the violence. And you know, that more is, there was an article in the National Review by a pro-life vegan, so that's why I bring it up. It's not my magazine of choice. By Matthew Scully, who said that, you know, I think it was called something like "Why I'm a Pro-Life Vegan." So that caught my interest, obviously. And he when he talks, and he is equally opposed to both violence towards animals and also to, or more opposed to abortion, actually, I think. But he said, you know, for somebody who has an abortion, person is typically facing very difficult circumstances. So he even in that context says that and there is no similar circumstance faced by somebody deciding whether to eat a piece of cheese. That's just not, the person is not in a position of, oh my God, what am I going to do? My whole life is going to be destroyed. And if that's their perspective on it, they have, I think, somewhat distorted perspective. So yes, I think we absolutely need to do it carefully and cognizant of our moral obligations, not only to animals, but also to the people to whom we advocate.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is for both of you, but maybe particularly for Michael. With regard to this principle you offer toward the end, which is very interesting, that there's a difference between, let's say, having something taken away from you that you already have is worse morally than not getting it in the first place. Thought experiment that might be retooled for this. I was trying to explain to a student or illustrate for a student the idea that what you don't know can harm you. And I use this example that might have an application here, and it is, let's say you win the Publishers Clearinghouse. They put $1 million in your mailbox. You don't know it. Before you find out, I steal it from your mailbox, and you never find out that you won the Publishers Clearinghouse. And I said to my students, aren't you in fact harmed by that, even if you don't know that you had it stolen from you? First, I have students pushing back very hard, saying, no, I'm not harmed if I don't know that I didn't get it. And I try to get them to understand that there's clearly a harm there. Now, what if we retool this slightly? I don't know if this will work or not, but it would be something like this. Is it worse for me to take $1 million from you that you know you have, rather than stealing $1 million you didn't know you got yet?
Yeah, right. So I don't want to endorse the proposition that something can never be harmful unless you know about it.
I just meant you said one is worse.
Right, that's right. So yes, I'm getting there. So I'm saying that, so one can experience a setback to one's interest without being aware of that. But I think it's right that, comparatively speaking, right, the person who never learns of the fact that he got and lost $1 million is better off than the one who got it, learned of it, and then had it stolen, right? Because they both experienced the loss of $1 million, but the second has also experienced the frustration of his expectations.
And can I just add something to that? So also, I think what's interesting is that I don't think we would say that the moral manifestation of the endowment effect would have to precisely copy the scope of the actual endowment effect. So that even if a person doesn't experience the endowment effect in the circumstance that you described, that we would say that there's still an instinct that it's worse. What you've done to him is worse than if he never got that $1 million at all. And so that there's a sense of endowment that we recognize as a social community, that when somebody has something, it's worse to take it away than it is never to give it to them in the first place. And one of the examples we give, I think we give it in here, if not to be done, is that somebody who donates an organ, that they can't then get it back later, right? Like, even though it was their generosity, right? That somebody needs a kidney, I give them a kidney, Now my other kidney failed, so I want it back. I don't get it back, even though it's mine. It was mine to begin with. There's a I think a very strong sense that taking something away that belongs to someone else is wrong. That it's a kind of deep theft norm that that we think is reflected psychologically, but wouldn't necessarily mirror precisely the contours of the psychological.
They'll get, there are a lot of them, they'll get angry. You'll have violence, and violent vegans are like ugly. All right, there's stuff out there for you to buy. Please use exact change if you can. There's tables that have red and black. Those are the Rutgers colors. I wanted to sort of show I have a sense of aesthetic. And so there are tables out there for you to eat. We'll be back here, let's say, really in our seats, ready to go at 2:30. Okay, so that should give you some time. All right, thank you very much.